The church was cold, even for April. Dorothea Vane stood at the altar of St. Cuthbert's, in her plain white gown, and felt the cold move through the satin ribbon at her waist, through the thin fabric at her shoulders, into the bones of her hands where they rested against each other, just below her ribs. The church smelled of candles and of the early lilac. Someone had arranged in jars at the end of each pew, and of the damp wool of 100 gathered coats. The windows were high and narrow, and the light that came through them was the flat gray of a Somerset spring morning, the kind of light that shows everything plainly and flatters nothing. The nave was full. She had not expected it to be full. She had imagined something smaller, something quieter, something that required less of her face to hold still. Lady Marvell had insisted on the whole of the county being invited, and the whole of the county had apparently decided to come. And so Dorothea stood before them all, with her chin lifted and her breath controlled, and told herself, as she had been telling herself for 3 days, that this was the ordinary thing that women in her situation did. They stood at altars. They said the words that were asked of them. They managed. The small gold and garnet necklace pressed its warmth into the hollow of her throat, as it had done every day since her father pressed it into her hands the winter before he died, and she held on to that warmth as a kind of anchor, the one familiar thing in the particular ceremony of the unfamiliar. The Reverend Aldous Pike had the page open, and had drawn breath to begin, Mr. Boss. Mr. Ellison Greaves stood at her left with his hands clasped before him, and his chin lifted at the angle he favored, an angle that communicated satisfaction before satisfaction. Had been confirmed he was watching the priest. He was not watching her. In the 2 months since their betrothal, he had rarely watched her. She had noticed, except at the moments when he wanted something confirmed. She thought of the hour ahead, and told herself it would be done. She told herself she would manage. The door at the back of the nave opened without announcement. No one had expected a door to open. The guests nearest the back turned first, in that half-reluctant way of people who do not wish to appear startled in public. Then the turning spread, row by row, the way a wind moves across standing wheat, until the whole congregation had shifted to look at the doorway and at the man who stood in it. He was tall, with the bearing of a man who had learned stillness in conditions that punished movement. He wore a navy coat over white cravat and pale breeches, traveling clothes, not ceremony dress, and there was a quality of dust on his boots that said he had come some distance and had not paused to remedy it. He had a scar through his left eyebrow, a diagonal line pale against the weathered skin, and his gray eyes moved across the assembled congregation in one swift pass before they found her and stopped. She felt them stop. She did not know this man. She had never seen him in this county or in any other. She had no account of his name or his rank, or the reason he had opened this door. What she knew, in the way that the body knows things before the mind arrives, was that he was looking at her throat, not at her face, at the small gold and garnet necklace, resting in the hollow of her collarbone. He went entirely. Still, Reverend Pike saw his face. Reverend Pike, who had been a chaplain to the Ashmore family for 3 decades before his preferment to this parish, and who had baptized the man in the doorway in the winter of 1779, who had stood at gravesides for the man's father and his brother, and most recently and most grievously, his mother, dusted out his prayer book, with a care that was not quite calm, and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the stone nave, "A moment, please." Grieve turned. The congregation held its breath. Dorothea did not move, because she did not know what she was standing at the center of, and stillness seemed the only honest response to that particular kind of not knowing. The man in the doorway walked into the church. She had agreed to marry Ellison Greave in the 3rd week of January, which was the coldest week of a cold winter, and the 6th week after her father's death, in the parlor of the rented cottage, where she had lived for the past 4 years, and where she could no longer afford to live alone. Her father, the Reverend Edmund Vane, had been a man of great learning and moderate income, and no provision for what would happen after him. He had not planned to die at 59. He had not planned to leave his only daughter without income or connection or any of the practical instruments by which a gentlewoman of no fortune navigated the world after the loss of her last protector. He had left her his books, his notes on the Book of Job, a small amount of debt to the draper, and the necklace. The necklace he had pressed into her hands the evening before he died, in the hour when he was still lucid enough to know he was dying. It had been her mother's, he said. Her mother had worn it every day of her short adult life and had asked that Dorothea should have it when she was grown. It was not particularly fine. The gold was old and the setting was simple, and the garnets were small. 3 of them set in a shallow trefoil. Her father had held it with such specific tenderness that she had put it on at once and had not taken it off since, because wearing it was as close as she could come to holding both of them. She had managed the winter in the way that she managed most things, which was quietly and without advertising her management to anyone who might take it as an invitation to arrange her life. She had given lessons in French and watercolor to the daughters of a local tradesman. She had accepted the hospitality of the vicar's wife without accepting so much of it that the accepting became a dependency. She had written 3 letters to a cousin in Bath, who had not responded to any of them. It was Lady Philippa Marvell who had brought Mr. Maltay Grieve to the cottage in January, with the brisk helpfulness of a woman who has decided a problem and wishes to present the solution. Lady Marvell was the highest-ranking woman in the near neighborhood, a widow of 58, with 2 married daughters, and a great deal of energy for the management of other people's circumstances. She was not unkind. She was in the specific way of women who have never been without a home or an income, deeply confident that she understood what Dorothea needed. "You are a very lucky girl," Lady Marvell had said, in the parlor with Mr. Genn. Grieve seated across the room examining the bookshelf. She had said it quietly, just to Dorothea, but in the tone of a reminder rather than a reassurance. "He is a man of means, and he is willing. At your age and in your situation, that is not a small thing." Dorothea had looked at the woman who was willing and calculated what she knew of him. He was 42 and had never married. He was a solicitor of some success in the county town. He spoke to her with the particular careful warmth of a man who has decided he is doing someone a favor, which is a kind of warmth that feels, on the receiving end, like the sun through winter glass. She was 24 and had no income and no alternatives that she could name. She had said yes. The betrothal had been announced at a dinner at Lady Marvell's house in early February, attended by all the people Lady Marvell had decided should witness it. Dorothea wore her best gown, which was the second best she had owned when her father was alive, and she sat beside Grieve, and she smiled when she was addressed, and she answered questions about the planned wedding with a composure that cost her, across the course of the evening, approximately what composure always cost her, which was most of what she had. Lady Marvell made a small speech, as the hostess, before the dessert. "Our dear Dorothea," she said, with a warmth that was entirely genuine and entirely certain of its own rightness, "has had a difficult winter, and we are so very glad to see her settled so happily." She looked down the table at Dorothea with the specific satisfaction of a woman who has solved something. "She is a very lucky girl, and I know she knows it." 3 of the guests nearest Dorothea turned to smile at her, in what they clearly believed to be a shared delight. She smiled in return, and held the smile long enough to be seen holding it, which she had learned was different from smiling. A practiced performance of expression that required the same kind of internal stillness as standing in a cold room without shivering. Her hands, below the table, had pressed her napkin into a narrow strip without her noticing. She noticed now, and smoothed it flat again. On her other side, Grieve received the compliments of the evening with the composed pleasure of a man who has purchased something at a favorable price and is gratified by the general recognition of his acumen. He touched her arm once near the end of the dessert course, in the way a man touches a thing he has acquired when he wishes to confirm the acquisition is complete. She sat very still and breathed through it, and thought of her father, who had touched nothing he did not love. That spring, the weeks between the betrothal and the wedding, she occupied herself, as she had always occupied herself, which was by doing what was useful and not making herself conspicuous in the doing of it. It was a skill she had developed over years of reduced circumstances, the skill of competence made invisible, of help rendered without the social theater of help. When Sarah Briggs, the blacksmith's wife, fell into a fever in the second week of March, Dorothea went to her. Thomas Briggs was a large and capable man when it came to iron and fire, and entirely lost when his wife could not lift her head from the pillow. He had 4 children under the age of 9, and no idea how to manage a sick room. Dorothea managed the sick room. She went every evening for 11 days, and on the 2 worst nights, she did not go home at all, and she read aloud from the books Sarah had enjoyed before her marriage, and she kept a record of the medications the surgeon had prescribed, and she managed the youngest child's croup when it arrived on the 5th night and somehow overlapped with everything else. She did not tell Lady Marvell. Lady Marvell would have thought it unsuitable for a woman in her position to be nursing in the house of a tradesman, however worthy the tradesman. Dorothea had learned, over time, that the people most enthusiastic about her welfare were often the least enthusiastic about her exercising any agency within it. She also did not tell Grieve. Grieve had said once with his chin at its familiar angle, "You are too free with your time, Dorothea. A wife must be careful about the company she keeps." He had meant it as correction. She had absorbed it and said nothing, and continued to go to the Briggs cottage, because Sarah Briggs had once walked 3 miles in January to bring her a basket of food in the first week after her father's death, when she had not eaten properly and had not known how to ask for help, and she did not know how to weigh that kindness against the opinion of a man who had not yet offered her any. Nicholas Ashmore, Earl of Ashmore, came into the county on the 20th of March to inspect the Stanton property, which was part of the Ashmore estate and had been poorly managed by his steward for 2 seasons while he was on the peninsula. He did not intend to stay more than 4 days. His steward, a man named Holt, who had been with the estate for 20 years, and who had the particular loyalty of men who knew exactly what kind of family they were working for, met him at the property with a full accounting of everything that needed attention. The accounting took most of the first day. On the second day, Holt mentioned, in the way that he sometimes mentioned things that were not strictly his business, that the late Reverend Vane's daughter had been tending the blacksmith's wife through a lengthy fever, and that Thomas Briggs's youngest had survived a bad few nights because of her. "Miss Vane," Nicholas said. "She's to be married in April," Holt said, and something in the way he said it was not quite approving. To the solicitor Grieve, Lady Marvell arranged it. Nicholas knew Lady Marvell by reputation. He knew Grieve by one professional encounter in which the man had arranged a contract with the specific care of someone who wished to appear to be serving his client's interests while most efficiently serving his own. He thought of his mother, who had had a particular instinct for people and whose instinct had never been wrong in any case Nicholas could name. He said, "I'll walk to the village this afternoon." He saw Dorothea from across the green, outside the blacksmith's cottage, in the act of returning the last borrowed items to the household: a clean quilt, a stack of books, a lidded pot she had apparently brought on one of the early days and had not taken back. She was in a plain brown walking dress, with a Spencer jacket that had been mended at the left cuff, and she was laughing at something. The blacksmith's youngest had said, a real laugh, not the managed social performance of a laugh, and the child had its arms around her knees and was attempting to climb her. She bent and lifted it without effort, the child settling onto her hip as naturally as if it had always lived there. And she continued whatever she was saying to Thomas Briggs over the child's head, one hand moving slightly to illustrate a point, and Briggs was laughing too, and his wife was visible through the open door of the cottage, sitting upright in a chair by the window with color in her face, again watching them. She wore a gold and garnet necklace at her throat. It caught the March light as she moved, a brief warm flash of red gold against the plain linen at her collar, and Nicholas's gaze fixed on it with the sudden absolute attention of a man who has heard his own name spoken in a crowd. Nicholas stopped walking. He had walked this lane 100 times in his childhood, and a dozen times since his return, and his feet knew its stones and its cambers and the particular place where it narrowed beside the stile, and none of that knowledge reached him now. He stood on the lane and looked at the necklace and looked at the woman wearing it, and felt, very precisely, the weight of 2 years of a particular kind of carrying lift from him, not vanish, but shift, the way a pack does when a second pair of hands takes a portion of it. He had seen that necklace twice in his life, once around his mother's neck in the portrait that hung in the gallery at Ashmore Park, and once in her hand the night she was dying, when she had pressed it toward him and told him what he was to do with it. He had reached for it in the morning, and found her hand empty. He had assumed, in the fog of grief, that he had imagined it, or that it had fallen somewhere in the room. He had searched for it afterward, and found nothing. He had carried the absence of it for 2 years as one more failure in a season of them. He stood on the village green in the pale March sun and watched a woman he had never met laugh at a child with his mother's necklace at her throat, and felt something in his chest shift like a compass needle finding north. He did not introduce himself that afternoon. He watched from a sufficient distance until she had said her farewells and set off back along the lane, and then he turned and walked back to the Stanton property and sat in the empty dining room for a long time. What his mother had told him was this: "The necklace belongs to the woman I gave it to. She will not know its name. When you find her, you will understand why I gave it away. And Nicholas, if you find the woman and she is not free, you must make her free. I did not give it as an ornament. I gave it as a charge." He had understood at the time that she was feverish and perhaps not lucid. He had been wrong about that, as he had been wrong about several things in the past few years, all of which had turned out to matter more than he had known. He extended his stay. He asked Holt to find out what he needed to know about Miss Vane's situation. Holt found out. Nicholas did not sleep particularly well in those 2 weeks. He wrote no letters, made no overtures, attended no social events in the neighborhood. He reviewed the terms of the betrothal contract when Holt produced a copy, and he sat with the copy for a long time, in the way that he sat with documents that required him to decide what he was willing to do. He was not a man who acted without consideration. He was also not a man who, having considered, delayed. He thought of his mother's face in the last hour he had seen it alive, the specific clarity of her eyes in the midst of everything else that was failing, the way she had pressed his hand around the necklace with a force that surprised him, given how little force she had left. He had told himself in the months after that it was the fever speaking, that dying women say things that are true only to them, that a man of sense does not build his decisions on instructions given in an hour of extremity. He had been wrong about this, as he had been wrong about the war being quick, and about his brother being lucky, and about his own constitution being equal to whatever he was asked to endure. He was learning at 33 to trust the things he had dismissed at 31. He spread the betrothal contract on the table of the empty dining room and read it 3 times from the beginning, and what he read made the cold settle more deeply into him than the March air warranted. The morning of the 28th of April. A letter arrived for Dorothea from Greaves' solicitor. She read it in the kitchen of her cottage, standing up, before she had finished her tea. It was not addressed to her as such, it was addressed to the situation she represented, which was the disposition of her late father's remaining debt. The letter explained, in the careful language of men who wish to be understood without being accountable, that the debt would pass to her husband upon their marriage, and that her husband had agreed to settle it, and that this settlement was contingent upon the wedding proceeding on schedule, and that any delay or dissolution would restore the debt to her person in full, at which point certain legal instruments currently held in abeyance would be activated. She read it twice. She folded it. She placed it in the pocket of her dressing gown. So that was what kind of favor it was. She was not lucky at all. She was merely held. She dressed in her wedding gown with hands that were entirely steady, because she had always been steady when she most needed not to be. She put on her white gloves. She wound the garnet necklace around her throat and fastened the small clasp, and she felt the weight of the 3 garnets settle against her skin as they had settled every morning for 5 months, and she thought of her father's hands, and of her mother's life, and of all the small dignities a woman assembles when the larger ones are taken from her. And she went out to be married. Lady Marvell was waiting outside the church with 3 of her friends and a 4th woman. Dorothea did not know, but who had been told, apparently, the appropriate amount to know about the situation. "There she is," Lady Marvell said in the warm, carrying voice she used for public situations. "Our dear Dorothea. Very lucky girl." She said it to the assembled women in a tone that was its own full stop. And the 4th woman, who was a stranger, made a small sound of agreement, and 2 of the others smiled, and Dorothea smiled in return, and climbed the church steps. A woman near the back pew, a neighbor whose garden abutted the lane behind Dorothea's cottage, and who had heard the whole exchange, caught the eye of the woman seated beside her. "Lady Marvell says she's a very lucky girl," she said, in an under voice. Dorothea, who had paused to adjust her glove in the vestibule, heard it perfectly. She smoothed the glove and went inside. The cold of the nave was specific and immediate. The garnet necklace warmed against her skin as she stood at the altar and waited. She heard the door open. She heard the congregation shift. She felt the sound of it more than she heard it. The particular disturbance of air that means a room full of people have stopped looking at one thing and begun looking at another. She turned. He was standing in the doorway with the April light behind him, and his gray eyes fixed on her throat, and she felt the force of that look in a way she could not account for, a pressure that had no reasonable source. She did not know his face. She did not know his name. She knew the scar through his left eyebrow, and the particular stillness of him and the way he looked at the necklace as though it had said something to him that she could not hear. Then Reverend Pike's voice stopped the ceremony. The next minutes arranged themselves with the quality of a dream in which ordinary things have edges that are too sharp. Pike crossed to the end of the altar step. Greaves' face set into the careful blankness of a man who is calculating his position. The man from the doorway walked the length of the nave in a silence that was not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a full room that has stopped breathing. And he stopped at the altar rail, and he looked from Dorothea's face to Greaves and then to the necklace one more time. And then he turned fully to face the man who had been about to marry her. "She is not free to marry you, Greave. She never was." His voice was level and quiet, and it carried to the last pew, without effort, in the way that voices trained in military commands carry everywhere that matters. Greaves' chin came up. "You have no standing here, my lord." "I have every standing here." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The terms of the betrothal contract were represented to Miss Vane as a settlement of her father's debt. That settlement was contingent, by your own solicitor's letter, on the marriage proceeding. The debt used as leverage was assigned to your holding from a third party 2 months before the betrothal was proposed. You created the instrument of her obligation before you introduced yourself to her. He paused. The pause was precise. Mr. Holt. From the side door of the nave, the steward, who had quietly taken a seat in the last minutes of the congregation settling, now rose and walked forward with a document in his hand, which he placed, without theater, on the altar rail. "The debt is discharged," Nicholas said as of this morning. "Miss Vane owes you nothing. The contract is void." Greave looked at the document. He looked at the Earl. His face went through several calculations in rapid sequence, and each calculation arrived at the same result, which was that he had miscounted something and the room had seen him do it. He was not a stupid man. He recognized when a position had collapsed. He turned without speaking and walked down the nave and out of the church. His footsteps on the stone were even and controlled. The footsteps of a man who is performing composure and who knows that the performance is visible to everyone watching, and everyone was watching. The great door swung shut behind him with a sound that was neither loud nor soft, but simply final, the sound of a thing settling into its own weight. The congregation held the silence for a moment that was longer than most silences at a country wedding in Somerset. Then the silence shifted into the particular register of a roomful of people exhaling together, of whispered names and turned heads, and the soft percussion of a fan, applied more urgently than the temperature warranted. Reverend Pike picked up his prayer book and set it aside again with the deliberateness of a man who has done the thing that was required and is now returning to his ordinary self, and something in the set of his old shoulders suggested that his ordinary self was not displeased. Lady Marvell, in the third pew from the front, sat with her fan open in her right hand and her hazel eyes moving between the altar and the door through which Grieve had departed, and something in her face shifted, quite slowly, from certainty into something that was not yet doubt, but was its near neighbor. She was a woman who had been confidently right about most things for 58 years, and she was encountering, with visible effort, the possibility that this had not been one of them. Dorothea stood at the altar with the garnet necklace warm against her throat and her hand still, and looked at the man who had walked the length of her wedding to stop it. There was a silence that was not empty. "Who are you?" she said. "Nicholas Ashmore," he said, "Earl of Ashmore." She knew the name. She had known it her whole life in the way that one knows the names of the great families of the county. As geography, as weather, as the names of things that are simply there, she had never attached it to a person. She attached it to this person now, to the scar through his left eyebrow and the gray eyes that were still very quietly reading her face. "You stopped my wedding," she said. "Yes, on the basis of a debt I was not told had been purchased." "Yes, and the necklace," she said. It was not a question. He was quiet for a moment. Around them the congregation had stopped even the pretense of looking elsewhere. He seemed entirely unaware of them, or entirely unbothered by them, which she recognized as a kind of practiced discipline and understood. He is not cold, she thought. He is careful. There is a difference. "May I explain?" he said. "Not here." "No," she agreed. "Not here." They walked out of the church together, through the nave and through the vestibule, and into the April air of the churchyard, which smelled of the new grass growing up between the old headstones and of the lilac someone had planted long ago against the south wall, and which was beginning to open. The congregation did not immediately follow. The congregation, whatever it intended to do, eventually was for the moment suspended by the absolute novelty of what it had just witnessed, and by the visible fact that Reverend Pike had sat down in the front pew with his hands folded and shown no inclination to chase anyone. They stood in a churchyard between a headstone for someone named Thomas and a headstone for someone named Patience, and he told her about his mother. He told her about the night she was dying and the necklace in her hand, and what she had said. He told her about searching the room afterward and finding nothing. He told her about 2 years of believing it lost, and then about the particular March afternoon on the village green, when a woman he had never seen was laughing at a child with his mother's necklace at her throat, and something in the world had rearranged itself into sense. He told her about the betrothal contract, and what Holt had discovered about the debt's provenance, and about the letter to her solicitor that had been intercepted, and about the 4 days it had taken him to confirm what the contract said before he was willing to act on what it implied. He was precise. He did not elaborate beyond what was necessary, and he did not perform the telling of it. She listened without interrupting, with the specific, careful attention she gave to things that seemed to require the whole of it. "You did not introduce yourself," she said when he finished. "In March? When you saw me?" "No." "Why not?" He considered the headstone of Thomas for a moment. "Because I was not certain what I was prepared to do." "I did not want to say anything to you before." "I was certain." She thought about that. "What were you not certain of?" "Whether I was willing," he said, "to ask you to overturn your life on the basis of a necklace and a dying woman's instruction." He turned to look at her. "I decided I was. I was not willing to ask you without first removing the instrument that would make it feel like there was no other choice." He paused. "You should have a choice." The lilac opened a little further in the light. A bee moved through it. Dorothea looked at the 3 small garnets warm at her throat and thought of her mother, whom she had not known long enough, and of her father, who had pressed this into her hands, with the specific tenderness of a man entrusting something too valuable to keep himself. She thought of the woman who had given it away. She thought of why a woman gives away the thing she loves most, What did your mother say she asked about the woman she gave it to? He was quiet for a moment. She said she was the finest person she had ever known. After my father. She said she had been overlooked by everyone who mattered, and seen clearly by no one who could change it. She said she hoped the necklace would find its way to the daughter when the daughter was grown, and would know what to do with it. Dorothea pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in a churchyard in her wedding gown, with an earl she had met 20 minutes ago standing 3 feet away from her, and she did not, but it required the whole of the steadiness she had left. She knew my mother, she said. Yes, and she gave her the necklace she loved most. Yes. She was quiet for a long time. In the church behind them, the sounds of the congregation rearranging themselves had begun, the low murmur of people processing together what they had witnessed. Somewhere at the edge of it, she could hear Lady Marvel's voice, though not its words. She looked at the man standing in the churchyard, with his boots still dusty from the road, and his gray eyes entirely steady on her face, and she thought that he had driven 2 years to find the necklace, and spent 4 days to find the debt, and settled it this morning before the wedding, so I would not have to weigh the necklace against the debt. He is not cold at all, she thought. He is simply a man who learned not to speak until he knew what he was saying. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said, I should like, if you are willing, to take you to see the portrait. My mother is wearing it, in the portrait, exactly as you are wearing it now. He paused. And after that, if you are willing, I would very much like to know you. She looked at him. He was looking at the necklace again, and then at her face, and the thing in his gray eyes was not calculation. It was not propriety or management or the careful warmth of a man doing someone a favor. It was the look of a man who has been carrying a debt for 2 years and has just understood where to take it. I am willing, she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked out of the churchyard, through the iron gate, past the lilac, into the lane, with the April sun on the gray stone of the church behind them and the soft green of the Somerset hills ahead. She could feel, as she walked, the weight of the 3 garnets at her throat, and it felt, for the first time in 5 months, like exactly what it was, not a burden, not a comfort, something altogether more alive than either. By June she had seen the portrait. She had stood before it in the gallery, with the afternoon light falling sideways across the canvas, and recognized the necklace at the painted throat before she recognized anything else about the woman wearing it. And then she had looked at the face for a long time. A face that was dignified and warm, and that looked at the painter with the direct gaze of a woman entirely comfortable in her own estimation of the world. And she had thought, yes, that is exactly right. She had also seen the Ashmore Library, all 4 rooms of it, which was the kind of library that belonged to a family who had genuinely read the books rather than acquired them as architecture. She had found her father's name in the margin of a volume of sermons, in a handwriting that was not the late Countess's but was clearly a correspondence, and she had sat with the book for an hour in the afternoon, quiet, and felt the world arrange itself into a shape that was stranger and warmer than anything she had imagined for it. She had seen the kitchen garden where the herbs were newly planted, and the small sitting room on the north side of the house that had been the late Countess's favorite room and was full of books, with annotations in the margins, annotations that were dry and precise, and occasionally very funny in the way of a woman who had strong opinions and had decided the margins were the appropriate place for them. She had met Holt, who was quiet and correct and had the expression of a man who had been right about something, and was content not to say so. She had written to the cousin in Bath, who had finally written back, surprised and somewhat astonished by the turn of events, and whose letter managed to convey, in the careful way of people who have failed to respond to 3 previous letters, that she had always believed Dorothea capable of anything. They were married, in September, in the chapel at Ashmore Park, in a ceremony attended by the people they wished to have there, which was a small number and a careful selection. Reverend Pike conducted the service, at the specific request of them both, and he did it with the solemnity of a man who has been waiting for exactly this and had not entirely given up hope. That evening, in the small sitting room on the north side of the house, Dorothea sat before the fire in her wedding dress and listened to the first of the September rain beginning against the windows. Nicholas crossed the room and sat beside her, and without ceremony he reached to the clasp at the back of her neck and undid the necklace carefully, with hands that had learned precision under conditions that were less gentle than this. He held it for a moment in his palm, the 3 small garnets catching the firelight, and then he refastened it at her throat. "It belongs there," he said. She looked at the fire. She thought of her mother, who had worn it every day of her short adult life, and of the woman who had given it away in the certainty that it would find its way to the right hands, and of her father, who had pressed it into her hands in the last of his lucid hours because he understood that some things are too valuable to lose. The finest person she had ever known, seen clearly by no one who could change it. She laid her hand over the garnets. They were warm. Outside, the rain moved across the park in one of those September sweeps that arrive without warning and leave everything cleaner. The fire settled. On the writing table in the corner, her father's annotated copy of the Book of Job sat beside the 3 volumes of the Countess's journals that Holt had found in the library chest and brought to her last week, and somewhere in those pages was the beginning of a friendship that had lasted a life and outrun it and had reached forward finally, into this room and this fire and this quiet. Nicholas said nothing further. He was not a man who used words when the thing had already been said. He is not cold, she thought. He has never been cold. She leaned her shoulder against his in the firelight and listened to the rain. "If Dorothea's story moved you, stay a little longer. Tell me in the quiet of the comment below which moment you'll carry with you, and I will know you were here until the end." The fire burned. The rain continued. The garnets rested at her throat, warm and found. In the home they had always been meant to reach,